So let's give this a shot. We're going to talk about Aristotle's Poetics, but we're not going to talk about it in the classical philosophical sense, but a lot more about how it applies to reading Othello, because that's going to be our next play that we're taking some time to kind of examine. We're going to talk a lot about tragedy, and not in the common word, the way we normally use it, meaning like a bad thing, but more about in the dramatic sense, and not dramatic as in like all over the place, but dramatic as in drama, which is talking about plays. The name Aristotle is a name you've probably heard quite a bit of. He was indeed a Greek philosopher, scientist, but also a critic. And really, we'd like to call him the world's first film critic, because what he did is take a look at a number of different dramas and plays, all this amazing artistic work that was being taken and written by the Greeks at that time, and decided to take the mathematical average, or take a look at the spikes and the highs and lows, and get a sense of what works and what doesn't. So what he decided is that the most effective tragic drama includes a handful of very specific critical elements, and we're going to take a look at a few of them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this idea called the three unities. These are three different things that Aristotle said will help bring cohesiveness and unity to a single tragedy. The first one is called a singleness of time. This is him saying that the action of a play should take place within a single revolution of the sun, or one day. Again, remember what he's looking for is this idea of what is going to have the most impact on an audience. So this still holds true to a lot of television shows today. There's one particular drama that has a lot to do with everything taking place within the span of one day. You may be familiar with some of this. 24. The first two seasons are the best ones. I kind of lost track after the most recent ones. But fans of the show have kind of said part of what helps add drama and tension to the show is because it only takes place within the span of one day. Every episode is the same hour, and the show runs in real time. So part of the impact behind that is that every single second counts. When you stop at a red light, it actually makes every single moment really matter and can actually literally be the difference between life and death. The second one that Aristotle talks about is called the singleness of place. Now, this has to do with his notion that the scene of a play should only be set in one location. Now, you may agree or disagree, but what he says about tragedy, and again, not necessarily entertainment, but all kinds of tragedy, is by focusing the play in the same place, it allows the audience to kind of really, really get to know that place. Now, it's certainly not a tragedy, but the closest TV show I could think of is Friends and Central Perk, how every single show usually uses that same set. You get to know the place, you learn all the ins and outs, and you become very, very familiar with it. The third singleness is called the singleness of action. Now, this one has to do with the idea that the play, this tragedy, should only be concerned with one central event. So there aren't a million different subplots, there aren't a million other things kind of pulling you in different directions. It's all about one main event. Now, my example, or perhaps my counterexample, is How I Met Your Mother. I love the show. I think it's great. It's a hilarious comedy. And part of what makes that and Seinfeld and a number of other comedies work when you have a bunch of different subplots that all jam in together at the last second. But we're not dealing with comedy. We're dealing with tragedy. And the main point with this is taking a look at everything all together. You have a singleness of time, a singleness of place, and a singleness of action. What this means is that you're kind of removing all of the other stuff out of the audience's periphery. This means that you're only dealing with one day. You don't have to do all time skips or anything crazy. You're only dealing with one place, which means that you don't need to keep track of what is where and who goes in what direction, and you only have one main event. This is going to help sharpen and finely tune, or to sort of hone in the tragedy to have the greatest effect on the audience. Aristotle now is also going to talk about spectacle, or more specifically, the lack of it. Spectacle, if you know the term, has to do a lot with anything gruesome, gory, anything that's really kind of meant to draw in the eyes. Now, what Aristotle suggests for tragedy is that anything of this nature should not be seen on stage, but should instead be insinuated, which means kind of hinted at, not shown 100%, but suggested. I like to reference horror movies a lot in this reference. Now, you may be a fan, you may not, but many horror fans will agree. And just think of any of the scary stuff, right? What's scarier? The monster that's directly in front of you, or the monster that's just off screen and people are reacting to it, but you can't see it? Your imagination starts running away with it. Blair Witch Project is a very, very famous horror movie, super low budget, super lo-fi, a lot of the found footage notion of like what horror movies have kind of become nowadays. But fans have all kind of agreed, and part of why this made such a huge impact at the time is this idea that you didn't see half of anything that's kind of going on. There was a monster, there was something else that was happening, but it was all off stage. So what happens is your mind starts to fill in those gaps. And usually, and especially in ancient Greek times, they certainly didn't have any CGI effects. All of the imagination can be far more effective than actually what's in front of you. Another slightly more modern reference, if anyone's an M. Night Shyamalan fan, Signs is an alien movie. It's about an alien invasion and how these humans are trying to fight them off. The difference is that you don't see the alien until probably half an hour before the end of the movie. The effect of that, however, is that you just constantly see suggestions and hints. You see people's reactions to things. And when you actually do see the alien, it has a massive impact. It's this giant splash on the screen. It's all about the delayed gratification there. The opposite effect, Plan 9 from Outer Space is a very, very infamously terrible quasi-horror movie. I use horror with scare quotes that are happening there. This sort of presents the counter-argument. If you're trying to go all spectacle all the time, you're placing that on priority versus everything else. And again, Aristotle is all about what's going to have the best effect of the tragedy on the audience. By really focusing on the spectacle and the gore, it's, again, a distraction. It's pulling back to those unities. It's taking something out of one of those unities. Okay, so now we come to the real important stuff. The notion of a very interesting phrase called the tragic hero. Now, you often think of tragedy and you think of the word hero, and these two things seem diametrically opposed. However, Aristotle has a very strong argument, and we're going to use the notion of the tragic hero in a lot of our reading of Othello. The tragic hero is a person who has these certain qualities. So there's a person who's larger than life, someone who is, and I don't mean just in terms of physical stature, I mean someone who really fills the room, right? When someone walks in, everyone's eyes are drawn to that person kind of instantly. The tragic hero has what's called noble stature. Again, noble, thinking of nobility. Someone like a king or a prince or a president. Someone who carries themselves and knows they have that authority. It's a person who is the leader of his people in some fashion. Not just a follower, but a leader, a trailblazer. Someone who is going to use this noble stature and use it to kind of guide and shape the people, the community that's kind of around him. The tragic hero is a person who has essentially good qualities, right? This is not the villain. You can have someone who's larger than life and is a leader of people, but a bad guy. No, we're talking about the good person. He has essentially good qualities. You're rooting for this person in some sense. And it's a person who is in some way responsible for the well-being of his community. So there's a social responsibility attached to this. A person who's at the top of the pyramid, has a lot of people kind of looking up toward him and feels this nudge, this guide to do something good for the community. However, what's going to make this not just a hero, but the tragic hero is what's called the tragic flaw. Now, in the Greek terminology, this is known as the hamartia. And this is an essentially good quality that turns into a bad quality through its excess. Stop and think about that for a second. It's something good, but if you have too much of it, it loops back around and it becomes kind of terrible. Here's an example. Hubris is a phrase you may have heard. We've actually co-opted it into the English language. But in Greek, it's a term that means excessive pride. It's a very, very typical tragic flaw in Greek tragedy. Oedipus the king and Oedipus Coloneus deals a lot with this notion of pride, because pride is good, right? You want to be proud of the work that you do, especially if you work very hard, but you have too much pride. What does that turn into? Well, you start to become arrogant. You start to become a little cocky. You start to push things around. You start to lose sight of things, and you kind of get so much that you're so full of yourself, you kind of tumble off that cliff. It's a very, very classic example of what can be a tragic flaw. This is an increasingly dated reference, but I always like to reference The Dark Knight. Batman Begins, Dark Knight Rises. Dark Knight is still my favorite of all the three, and if you've never seen him, I don't know if you're exactly old enough for me to recommend an R-rated movie, but it's an excellent film. I would suggest it when you are of the proper age and authority. That said, so this is the story of Batman. This is the story of him in Gotham City, but Batman is certainly not a tragic hero. If you take a look at some of those other ideas, he has some good qualities, but he's certainly not a leader. He's kind of a vigilante, right? There is, however, another person that I think classically follows many of the same traits of the tragic hero. So if you have seen the movie, think about it for a second, or if you know the Batman universe, who is a noble, heroic figure, someone who acts as a public leader, but this is a person who suffers from a fatal flaw. Think of The Dark Knight. Think of some of the characters named Batman. Well, if you have seen the movie, you may already be kind of screaming at your computer